All right, we are live. This is exciting stuff here. Lolo, how
Woo!
are you doing?
You know what? I'm feeling very live this evening.
That's great. That's great. I'm
I'm
pretty excited for
excited.
this one.
Yeah, me
Yeah,
too.
I am. Oh, go ahead.
Just to refresh on everything this week, um, I was, what started off as what was going to be like kind of going back over everything turned into a 7 hour deep dive down the Deutero-Isaiah rabbit hole. So that was super fun. What
This
did you
is
do
a
at 2:30 in the
series.
morning? You don't study Deutero-Isaiah? Psh.
Usually I'm doing language study or something like that instead, but sometimes I'm diving into this because, I've seen something from Daniel Peterson or Mormonism with the Murph is coming up with some topic or something. And so I've got to dive into that and write a stupid long comment on YouTube about it. Yeah, so it looks like we are good on both platforms. I'm just kind of eyeballing them to make sure that everything's working there. And we are
That's
running.
awesome.
Uh, so yeah, this is like you said, this is a serious rabbit hole. It is a
Buddy.
very complicated scholarly topic in biblical studies. Um, Fortunately, what is really complicated is not really what we're going to have to actually dive into for this issue. There is some good scholarly consensus on some big picture topics, and that's what matters for the Book of Mormon Deutero-Isaiah issue. So let's go ahead. I'm going to pull up the slide deck here. So this is part two overall of the evidentiary highs and lows
Mm-hmm.
series that we are working on here. Last week, or not last week, earlier this week, we talked about Nahum and the
Yes.
altars there out at Marib. So that was really the highs for Book of Mormon historical evidence. In this
I mean,
episode, we are
foolproof.
going to
Foolproof.
foolproof, right?
100%.
This time around, we are going in the exact opposite direction for what I call the death knell for Book of Mormon historicity. Um, so I think what's important, though, is to give an overview of where we've already gone on this journey, because this episode, I think, is going to really put an end to the question of Book of Mormon historicity for the rest of our series here. We'll begin to focus or reorient onto what the Book of Mormon has to say about theology and about philosophy and morality, other values that it may have. We'll touch on apologetics. Like when there are interesting apologetics to get after, we'll continue to talk about those topics. But for the
Mm.
discussion of historicity, I really think that I'm really hoping that this is the last dive that we
Uh,
have into it. So I think it's important to start from the
I
beginning here
mean,
with
I started watching the episode from Mormon Stories on the Deutero-Isaiah, and the whole time I
hmm,
just kept thinking, we never learned about this in Relief
no.
Society, y'all. This is not.
So a little bit of background, honestly, for this issue and why I have latched onto it. When I got home from my mission, I started kind of trolling around like anti-Mormon type sites, Facebook
Mhm.
pages, and the like. Specifically, the ones that had more of an evangelical Christian bent to
Yeah.
them.
Mhm.
Um, that was kind of an outgrowth, actually, of trying to explore what evangelical Christianity had to say about some of the same topics that we explore in the broader Mormon tradition.
Yeah.
Um, and there was one that I engaged with a little bit, and they brought up the Deutero-Isaiah problem. And I didn't really know anything about it at the time. And then I just kind of tried to ignore it, sweep it under the rug as I looked into it, because it's just, even from the perspective of an evangelical Christian who is wanting to set up the Bible as this literal text as it is presented to us, that is, God breathed exactly as we received it.
Yeah.
Um, they don't really like this issue. They don't like it either. But if you're going to move outside of biblical fundamentalism, then the issues of multiple authors for Isaiah becomes a lot more obvious, and it becomes a huge issue for the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, yeah, I encountered this early on in my post mission days, and it became a little bit of a shelf item. And the more that I came to understand it, the more I realized, oh, this is actually really a big deal. This is actually a
Yeah.
huge problem. And you can see it in the way that apologists try to handle this issue. And we'll talk about that.
Because, and I mean, I'm going to be really honest with you. I went to college. I know things. I'm like a smart person, but trying to really wrap my head around the whole Deutero-Isaiah, I understood the broader strokes, but a lot of it I just didn't fully understand. So for my benefit, let's pretend like we're teaching kindergarten for me.
Yeah, we're gonna start. We're gonna take this nice and basic, and like I said, the fortunate thing is we are not gonna have to dive into the very deep parts of the scholarly debate around multiple authorship and how all that plays in. So that's the good news. But yeah, let's go ahead and do just a quick summary of where we've already gone on this journey. So when we started, we talked about Lehi, about where he came from, and we talked about how it is possible for a historical Lehi to have existed, but he would have been a very unusual and unique figure, even within his small niche community in the outskirts of Jerusalem, in the refugee quarter of Jerusalem. And then we talked about Nephi killing Laban and how the way that story is described could not have happened historically. And so we moved off from 100% historicity from the start. From there, we've talked about how the monotheism that Lehi exhibits doesn't quite fit in with the time. We talked about how Trinitarianism and the high Christology of Lehi and Nephi doesn't really fit in the philosophical framework of a First Temple Jew. And then the way that Revelation is used also doesn't really fit with the purpose that text was written for. Then we dove into Nahum, into the Nim altars, and we saw some tentative points in favor of Book of Mormon historicity, but it's really if you squint at it and try to force the data to fit into that conclusion. We also showed that there's not really any way to use the text itself to get to Nahum. You have to
kind of like
insert other things into it.
Kind of like how the people are so much better looking before you leave the bar than they were when you got there. You're
kind of. You're fitting the data. It's
right.
Maybe. I don't know. This is not an experience that I'm too. When I went through my deconstruction phase, it was in the middle of the pandemic, so we
that's
going
fair,
to a bar wasn't even an option if I was into it.
That's fair. I mean, but in our case, we're beautiful all the time, so it really doesn't matter.
That's true. And folks now have the chance to see that live. So the claims that are made in 1 Nephi 19, verses 21 through 24, and chapters 20 through 21 are absolutely anachronistic. And I'm going to go ahead and actually read through here real quick what the issues are. So in 1921, Nephi says that surely did show unto the prophets of old all things concerning them. I don't remember who the antecedent is for that. And also he did show unto many concerning us, wherefore it must needs be that we know concerning them, for they are written upon the plates of brass. So the important thing is that he's referring to the plates of brass, starting in verse 21, and what's written upon it. So Nephi, I Nephi did teach my brethren these things, and it came to pass that I did read many things to them, which were engraven upon the plates of brass, that they might know concerning the doings of the Lord in other lands among people of old. So again, he is reading from the plates of brass, the things that were engraven upon it. Okay. And I did read many things unto them, which were written in the books of Moses, but that I might more fully persuade them to believe in the Lord their Redeemer. I did read unto them that which was written by the prophet Isaiah. For I did liken all scriptures unto us that might be for our profit and learning. And then in verse 24, it talks about them being a branch broken off from the tree of Israel. So there are a couple of pretty big issues with that. One is the reference to the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, basically. And the other is the writings of Isaiah. Remember, we're reading from the brass plates here, and we're going to go into chapter 20, which is a reference to Isaiah 48. And then, or really a direct quote from Isaiah 48. And then 21 is a direct quote from Isaiah 49. And remember, we're dealing with from the plates of brass, Isaiah 48 and 49. It's the big crux of the issue.
To clarify, they are saying we are reading this stuff we are reading from the plates of brass stuff that is quoting Isaiah.
Correct. I'm quoting the prophet Isaiah here. I'm reading from the plates of brass, and
Yes.
this is to edify my people about Jesus, or to edify my brethren about Jesus, and about the doings of the Lord in the lands that we came from, the lands of the people of old.
Got it.
They have now arrived in the Americas, and so they have latched on to, they are now a New World people pretty intensely here. And to be fair, if we're looking at this as Nephi writing this in 550 BCE or so, he was writing this later on in his life, he is now in the mindset of having settled into this new world, and it's just recounting. This isn't written this wouldn't have been written contemporary to his arrival.
Correct. Okay.
Okay. So the first issue that we have is the reference to the books of Moses. And Nephi is pretty clear about saying that he is reading from the books of Moses and the things that were engraven upon the plates of brass. Okay. The problem here is that the books of Moses that Nephi refers to, and we get a really clear picture of this in 2nd Nephi chapter 2, where they refer to the story of Adam and Eve. The version that Nephi is referring to is really largely the books of Moses as we have them today. That version did not exist until well after the exile. So well after Nephi would have already left Jerusalem and arrived in the New World, the books of Moses just didn't exist in that particular state. But Nephi is going to, and Lehi later on, is going to refer to that text in a way that's consistent with our knowledge, our version of the text, rather than the sort of the early proto-myths that would have informed the myths that are contained in the books of Moses.
Got it. And okay.
So one of the reasons why we can kind of see the fingerprints of knowing that the books of Moses, as we have them developed after the exile, is because of how it goes into feeding into a nationalist myth for rebuilding a kind of a broken people that are coming in, trying to figure out what's our place in this world. Our temple's been destroyed. We've been in exile. We've been in captivity. We're coming back into this land, but who are we now as a people? And as they're trying to negotiate that, to figure out who they are and to find that unifying idea to bring them together, the books of Moses, as we have them today, begin to develop, or are developed and then eventually written down and become the books as we have them, and then find them in the Dead Sea Scrolls and those places.
Right.
So with that said, it is probable that many of the stories that are in the books of Moses were a part of the First Temple Judaic tradition. At least parts of that story. So the idea of El at the head of the divine council and creating the world and forming man and woman in his image is potentially one of those oral traditions that would have existed before. But it's likely that the Adam and Eve story, as we have it today, did not come in until after the exile. So those sorts of developments are an issue.
So what would they have had anything equivalent to the Garden of Eden at that point?
I don't believe so. And my understanding is that a lot of the Garden of Eden story is a reference to other like Mesopotamian, Levant era myths, myths that were common to the area, but that it becomes in its own way a response to those ideas and a Jewish or a Hebrew version of those stories. And so until they're really put into the center of Babylon and engaging with those types of stories, that story doesn't necessarily develop. There are things like the flood of Noah is at least in part seems to be inspired by the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are other flood myths though that may have also informed, helping to contribute to that, because the flood myth in Gilgamesh is still quite different from the Noahic flood, but it's similar enough that we can see the common threads. The Tower of Babel story, on the other hand, is quite clearly a reference to an unfinished ziggurat in Mesopotamia or in Babylon that they're basically mocking in this particular story. And that has a lot more impact for somebody who's coming into the Second Temple period, the start of the Second Temple period, than it ever would for a First Temple Jew. So this is an issue, but how does it actually stack as an issue? There are some apologetic responses that would say, okay, so you have Joseph Smith coming in as the translator of this text, and he sees a reference to a story that, if you squint at it, looks a lot like the Adam and Eve story. Basically, the first two humans and having a gaining of knowledge and good and evil being introduced into the world. That
Okay.
story would not have existed in the way that it exists today, but Nephi or Brother Lehi could potentially be making some reference to that, kind of sideways, something that's similar but not quite that story. And so Joseph, as translator, just kind of fills in the gaps and puts in the modern version of that story.
Well, that's not a
Because
translation.
this is where we get into a lot of like the revelation narrative type translation process, or the catalyst theory type translation process, where Joseph's fingerprints are now an expected part of the text rather than it being him literally translating what was anciently written into as close as possible King James or modern English. I am not a fan of that theory for those reasons. I would find that irresponsible translation, and we'll talk about that issue with some other translation questions that will come up in the future. So while we're done with historicity, we're not necessarily done talking about like language issues that will be presented, because we're still going to have to talk ultimately about chiasmus later on. We're still going to have to talk about the if and conditional problem and some other things that pop in. They're interesting apologetic rabbit holes that I've dived far too down to just not do in this podcast or in the series.
I was going to say, can we please discuss the beginning in Mosiah theory? That
the Mosiah priority. Yeah, we'll talk about that more when we get to Mosiah 1, and we'll start to look at some of the things that have changed in the style and some things that authors are aware of on one end, but not necessarily seemingly aware of on the other, and some of the other things that have come up with that theory.
Right.
Sure.
Because
just remind me
that another rabbit hole.
Yeah, remind me when we get there, because there are some other things to potentially dive down with the first chapters of Mosiah.
Absolutely. I'm going to remind you weekly until then.
That might be overkill.
No. What? I have a very difficult time trying to understand how the way that they justify it, the apologetics, kind of make it even worse for me. Like, they are just trying so hard to shove the square peg into the round hole. And I mean, why double down?
I'm with you on that one. This one is frustrating to me because at some point in time, you have to the phrase indistinguishable from a fraud comes up. How can you tell whether or not what is produced is indistinguishable from a fraud? You have to have some way of saying, okay, if Joseph didn't make it all up, what would that look like? And how is that different from what we have? Or how is that what we have, and what we have is different from if he did make it all up? Like, basically, like, how can we tell that what we have is something more than just the product of Joseph's mind? And when you're basically saying that his fingerprints are now an expected feature of the text, we are now expecting to find Joseph Smith all over the place in the Book of Mormon. It becomes difficult for me as well to really say, okay, then we can really lean on this as a way of knowing that the Book of Mormon is actually what it claims to be.
So my question is, at that point, how can I differentiate from what is going to be Brother Joseph's opinion or his thoughts on how this story should go versus what is actually historical scripture? Like, how am I supposed to know? Like, is the word of wisdom Brother Joseph thinking this is what's best, or is it going to be actual script?
And this honestly is where I find the sort of the fundamentalism, the literalism that's really endemic to the Brighamite tradition so frustrating, because there isn't an absence of good ideas in things that Joseph Smith taught. There isn't an absence of good ideas in the Book of Mormon.
Agreed.
but it gets weighed down by this literalism that's so at the heart of a lot of the Brighamite tradition overall. And if you walk away from literalism, it becomes very difficult to sustain the models that the Brighamites have put forward, broadly speaking. The Josephites, on the other hand, I think have done a very good job overall of setting the stage for, you know what, you can kind of accept this at whatever level is actually like workable for you. This is between you and divinity.
And to clarify, just in case anybody's watching for the first time, Brighamites is going to be when the split happened after Joseph and Hiram passed from the martyrdom, those that followed Brigham Young versus those that followed the Joseph Smith lineage.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so one of the ways of that I kind of simplify thinking about those two traditions is that the Brighamites are Nauvoo Mormonism and the Josephites are Kirtland Mormonism. And that is an oversimplification of the overall traditions and kind of what they each bring to the table. But by and large, the ideas that and the theology that are developed in Nauvoo follow Brigham Young. And those ideas are largely abandoned by Emma and then ultimately Joseph Smith III and most of the rest of the Josephite traditions. It's complicated, and there's been a lot of things that have left one group or never really been a part of one of those groups and then come in, and there's a few other smaller sects that are out there that aren't really a part of either of those traditions, but those are the two largest bubbles. And anyway, so this is honestly, though, why there's not exactly a whole lot of Community of Christ apologists. They just don't need it because their tradition is not limited this way. It has the ability to be a lot more expansive and to accept that this can be non-literal, that this is scripture, but it is also myth, and we can accept it that way. So
Jesus
Joseph's
taught in
fingerprints did all of that.
parables.
Right.
Why is it a bad thing? Why does it have to be historically 100% accurate? Jesus taught in parables. Why would scripture be any different, I guess, is my question.
I'm with you on that one. And when we go further along into this series, I really do want to explore those ideas with you as well, as we kind of engage with that. It's like the ways that we can take this as non-literal, explore the value of the myth. This is just kind of an unfortunate reality of basically the entire historicity argument resting in First Nephi, because nothing else is actually testable. And so we just have to do historicity, historical claims over and over and over again for the first part of the series. And so I'm really excited, starting in next week's episode, getting into more of the philosophy and the theology issues.
Yes.
But again, so to your point, overall, with this apologetic response, I don't love it either. This is an outgrowth, I think, largely of the Book of Abraham problem, and now it's being applied in a bunch of other places. So the Book of Abraham, with those texts, with the original papyri not lining up at all with the Book of Abraham and that text, they've had to come up with some other explanations. Taking those explanations, slapping it into the Book of Mormon creates this kind of idea.
Yeah.
Weirdly, we're going to have two versions of this in this episode, because we've got this one that's applied to Joseph. We're going to have the same version with the Deutero-Isaiah problem as a potential apologetic applied to the Deutero-Isaiah problem, but it goes to Nephi.
Wait, so it's Nephi's fault. All right. I'm excited. So are we blaming Joseph or Nephi?
you kind of have dealer's choice when it comes to Deutero-Isaiah, but let's talk about that. So Data Over Dogma, I'm going to get out in front of this week. This is my Dan McClellan plug of the episode. Data Over Dogma did a great video talking about the Deutero-Isaiah problem in scholarship. They did not focus on the Book of Mormon side of this, so they were very much talking about what the scholarship actually is for Deutero-Isaiah. Fantastic episode. I recommend it. That's the plug. for if you're interested in this problem as a bigger biblical studies issue. Go to that. So Isaiah 1 through 39 is what is known as Proto-Isaiah. And this was likely written well before the exile, somewhere in like the 700 BCE. It was likely written by a prophet, Isaiah, who was in King Hezekiah's court. Scholars think that this person is actually a historical individual who literally existed, who, if not actually outright writing these texts, dictated them, not unlike a Moses to Aaron type story or a Joseph Smith to Oliver Cowdery type account. In some form or another, this prophet in King Hezekiah's court is responsible for the text that we now have as Proto-Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39.
Mm-hmm.
If you notice in chapters 1 through 39, there's a lot to do with the impending destruction of the kingdom of Israel by the Neo-Assyrians and some of the wars and things that are expected. And there's touching a bit on the impending incursion by the Babylonians. And one of the things that makes Isaiah so difficult to understand for modern readers is this post-biblical Christian insistence on reading Isaiah as having sort of three levels of prophecy, it being relevant to the time of the prophet Isaiah, being relevant to the time of Jesus Christ at the meridian of time, and then being relevant to the modern latter days. And so you need to read in these three levels of prophecy into every word that Isaiah speaks. And all it does is confuse
stressful.
And all that does is confuse what Isaiah is actually talking about, because that's not what the text is doing. So Isaiah 40 to 55 is what is called Deutero-Isaiah. This is the section that scholars largely have a consensus view of being Deutero-Isaiah. There are 66 chapters in Isaiah, though, and 56 through 66 are often either put into the bucket of Trito-Isaiah or are added on as a Deutero-Isaiah, or are considered sort of an amalgamation of different authors, no one author being responsible for that single part of the text. And that goes beyond the scope of our episode to really dive into Trito-Isaiah, because that's where the scholarship gets really confusing, where there's more contention and all that.
It was so much. It was so much.
It's so much. So the thing to simplify with this is that you have essentially two broad categories of models. You have single authorship or multiple authorship. If you want one single author responsible for Isaiah chapters 1 through 66, single authorship. If you're going with multiple authorship, it can be with just two authors. It can be any number beyond that. For our purposes, we're not locking into any one particular model. But we are going to focus on these two big different categories, because that's what actually matters for creating this issue. The only scholars who endorse a single authorship model are those that have dogmatic commitments to biblical literalism. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to the multiple authorship models from time to time, but by and large, there is not a valid claim that Isaiah was written by a single author unless you are so committed to the Bible being literal, being God-breathed in that one particular way, that you're basically you're fitting the evidence into your conclusion.
Isaiah was always confusing to me before I was LDS. Isaiah was always super confusing to me anyway, because looking at it from the multiple authorship, or just for me, more than just Isaiah, has made it make so much more sense.
Yeah. You can really actually see the change in tone and all that. I think that really helps to clarify it. Yeah. It's not a unified text, and we'll see that. I want to take a look at some examples of just how different the Proto-Isaiah section is from the Deutero-Isaiah section, just to get a feel to any viewers for just how wildly different those two parts are. But I do really want to emphasize that if you're going to go with a single authorship model, you're ignoring scholarship, basically. At some point in time, somewhere in that model, you are ignoring or diminishing what the data actually says, and you are choosing to go with a certain ideological commitment as opposed to what is in the data. Multiple authorship just wins the day in terms of the evidence and all that. So what even is the evidence for Deutero-Isaiah? Why do scholars even think that there was more than one author? So one of the big lines of evidence is stylistic. And we'll talk about style and stylometry and some other types of studies that or lines of research that go into text, and why I'm not a fan of them, broadly speaking, and why this particular line for me is, I think, there are some scholars who really, really like this particular line of evidence for multiple authorship. For me, it's the one I put at the bottom of the list. It's at the top of this list here, just to go into an order from what I think is least interesting to most. But it is, I think, kind of, the stylometry just has not been shown to me to be consistent enough at getting good results for me to really lean into it. But there are some interesting points with that. Some of the word choice is different and would be more obvious in the Hebrew than it is in the English, because English is the translation, and we're going to kind of flatten out some of those differences in that effort. But I'll leave that to the scholars to talk about, because I do not read biblical Hebrew. So I
don't read any Hebrew.
I
barely read English.
So that's not what I'm going to be able to dive into. But one thing that we can notice just by looking at the text is that Isaiah, the prophet in King Hezekiah's court, plays a very active role in Proto-Isaiah. He's very much involved in the goings on. He's having conversation with kings. He is receiving revelations and visions from divinity. He is making covenants. He is prophesying. And in Deutero-Isaiah, he's just not there. He just vanishes from the story. And so that's a pretty significant difference. It's not necessarily an end-all, be-all, but it is something that's very, very noteworthy, that the nature of the text just really changes. And the main figure, who's so prominent in what is identified as Proto-Isaiah, is just completely absent from Deutero-Isaiah onward. We touched on the second line here a little bit. So Proto-Isaiah is very much focused on the Neo-Assyrian conquest of the kingdom of Israel and the impending invasions by the Babylonians. And you can read through the all the various wonderful and very interesting sections of Isaiah when he's talking about, in this kingdom will have this curse brought upon them by the Lord, and this kingdom will have that if they, so on and so forth. And he's making these warnings in Proto-Isaiah. Deutero-Isaiah, on the other hand, famously has a prophecy where it names Cyrus, who would not exist for well over 100 years after Isaiah was doing the writing, but very specifically names Cyrus. Not some, not a king, not a king of Persia, not anything like, even though that would be its own set of issues if Persia was named. It names Cyrus, and identifies him as an anointed one, I believe, in that section. Cyrus is identified as a Messiah in different places in the Hebrew Bible. But here he just shows up as a named figure. And the common apologetic argument is, to that particular point, is, scholars just won't accept prophecy. So because they aren't willing to accept prophecy, and they have these ideological commitments against prophecy, they're going to ignore that, and they're going to post-date when the text was written to after, so that way they don't have to deal with prophecy. And we've talked about the way that actually works. And that is, you have the prophecy here, and it's super, super, super specific and accurate to the point that it is naming a king who would not even be born for like well over 100 years after.
100 years.
And then how specific does it get? so these same scholars that are making these arguments are going to be super invested, most likely,
Yeah.
in trying to say that the suffering servant, for instance, is Jesus. They really, really want the suffering servant to be Jesus, as an example.
Mhm.
But Jesus isn't named, and Jesus is a far more important Messiah figure
I was
than
gonna
Cyrus is.
say.
So where is this mention of Yeshua ben Joseph in in Deutero-Isaiah and these multiple authorships if Isaiah can just name these people who are well in advance? If Isaiah 29, which is in Proto-Isaiah, that's fine. If Isaiah 29 is actually dealing with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, this sealed book that could not be read, why isn't Joseph Smith named in that particular text if
I see
the
your point.
prophets are capable of that, right? So there's this different levels of consistency in that, and you have to account for that. And
Yeah.
if you can't account for that, then all you're doing is following a dogma. You're not following the data. And if we follow the data, it seems pretty clear that the Deutero-Isaiah section is written after Cyrus, which is well after the return from the exile.
Right. And I feel like you
so
were
that's where we got to
saying,
the return from the exile.
Yeah. So going down the other rabbit hole, doing some research into Cyrus and why he showed up, that super fascinating. But my point being, what would the benefit be for naming Cyrus, just to play devil's advocate, versus in the parts where they're talking about the Book of Mormon coming forth and not naming Joseph Smith? So why be so specific in some prophecies, but then super vague in others? What would be the benefit to them?
Right. I mean, especially in the ones that are more relevant to salvation, covenants, ordinances, things that are going to have a lasting impact for thousands of years. Right. Imagine how many people would be drawn to the overall restoration movement if Joseph Smith were specifically named in the text.
Right.
I would definitely have a different attitude about this particular movement if you could show me that Isaiah prophesied to Joseph Smith by name.
Right.
So
I mean, I feel at that point it's like, okay, well, it's a done deal. I'm good.
Right. I would be decently convinced at that point if that were there. So we just. So again, this is the same conversation that we had about the Revelation discussion, about dating the apocalypse of Nephi. But we use these same methods repeatedly, and you can see that this is systematized. We're using the same system over and over again. But an apologist has to come in and make certain special pleading for, why isn't Daniel accurate after 120 BCE? But he's super specific and accurate right at the time when scholars are saying that this part of the text would have actually been written. Why is Nephi super specific about Christopher Columbus and the American Revolution, but then has nothing to say about after the translation of the Book of Mormon in any amount of actual detail? So we'd have to engage with special pleading to make the apologetics work, or we just follow the data and what it actually says, and we go with that until other data comes in and contradicts our current model, and then we adjust the model accordingly.
And for us, it's not that there's no data coming in, it's that the data that's coming in is kind of not lining up with what the apologetics are saying. So then they're having to work extra hard to try to fit it into that perfect box,
Yeah, hold that thought. When we get to our conclusion, we'll go right back into why that is just a very salient point. Okay, I do want to talk about theology. He's made a great point. I want to talk about theology here for a second, because theology, this is for me the part that is just so fascinating. So we talked about this in the first episode, right? That Lehi is coming from this this culture that would have been inclusivist in their worship of Adonai, that they would have allowed for the worship of other gods in the land of Adonai, but that the people that were in that land, that were from that land, would focus on that worship. They did not have a monotheistic view, right?
Right.
It's monolatry or henotheism, depending on your definitions of each of those terms. Then he's going to come into Jerusalem, or his people will come into Jerusalem, and they're going to be focused more on an exclusivist type model of Adonai worship, where the only God that is allowed to be worshipped in the land of Israel or the land of Jerusalem is Adonai. No other gods, even if you're a foreigner in the land, no other God worship is allowed. And yeah, so then you eventually get into monotheism after the exile, right? Or the beginnings of what we consider monotheism after the exile. Okay. Proto-Isaiah has an exclusivist model and a lot of polemics against the inclusivist model. So because Isaiah is in the kingdom of Jerusalem and he's talking about the bad things that the kingdom of Israel are doing, he's writing a lot against what Israel, how the kingdom of Israel is worshiping Adonai, and focusing more on what the kingdom of Judah needs to be doing to worship Adonai, and what the consequences of the improper worship that Israel is doing, but what those consequences will be. That is a lot of where Proto-Isaiah is focusing his attention on. Deutero-Isaiah, though, isn't interested in those ideas at all. Deutero-Isaiah has a lot more of what will become monotheism as we understand it today. Monotheism still doesn't exist with Deutero-Isaiah. It's still a development, but it's a lot more like that. And the nature of Adonai really shifts as well, where in Proto-Isaiah, Adonai is making these warnings of destruction and violence and plague and suffering. Deutero-Isaiah's Adonai is much more focused on comfort and gathering and restoring, which makes sense for a post-exilic Judah to be focused on in Deutero-Isaiah. And then also in the Proto-Isaiah section, with that timeline of it being during all of that chaos, just before the kingdom of Israel is destroyed, for them to be focused on those ideas of destruction and suffering at that point. It fits with the historical model that way. The theology shift is just fascinating, and those innovations are consistent with what we know about the rest of the development of the worship of Adonai. And it does not fit a single authorship model because the span of those innovations is just too long for any one person to have done.
I was going to say that would be, I was going to say, really long lifetime there, buddy. You know,
it would be an exceptionally long lifetime from. I love this one. This one to me is the most interesting line of evidence. For me, it's the most convincing because the theology, the issues of theology are really, really hard to resolve otherwise. You can try to come up with an argument that historians just don't like prophecy, so they're going to ignore it in the case of Cyrus being mentioned in Deutero-Isaiah. Like, you can do something along those lines. But what you can't do is ignore all the evidence about this evolution of theology and just set that off to the side and say that one person was engaged in that whole practice of the theology as it moves. It's just too different, especially if you know what you're looking for. If you don't know, it's just confusing because you have one image of Adonai and then it just completely shifts later on.
Yes. And that was my issue. I was like, wait, why is God over here like this? But now God is very interesting. And
just
we were never taught that there was that huge gap between Proto versus Deutero, and that, this is Isaiah writing this, and this is, the Isaiah fan club writing this. I mean, it's very, very different.
Right. Yeah, it's I'm trying to think of what another good analogy of this would be with going from the Old Testament God into the New Testament, but having no connective fiber with Jesus or something along those. It would be something along those lines of trying to make that leap. And but once multiple authorship comes in, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear what we're dealing with, how we're dealing with those innovations. Yeah, I love this theory because of how it brings Isaiah to life in a way that it wasn't when I was trying to hold a literalist view of text. Okay, so this might be a little bit hard to read, but this table on the right here, I got from Fair. So thank you, Fair, for this wonderful table of Isaiah passages, the direct quotations, and the paraphrases of Deutero-Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. Yeah, it's extensive.
I can post that on our Facebook page and Instagram if you want.
Totally should after this include that there, just because I love this. Thank you, Fair. Thank you for posting the damning evidence for why this is an issue. So again, to reiterate here, Nephi is claiming to directly quote from the brass plates in 1 Nephi 20 through 21. These references would not have existed until decades after Lehi left Jerusalem, but the problems extend much further than that with the additional paraphrases. But the paraphrases could potentially be Joseph Smith's fingerprints. The direct quotations, especially these lengthy direct quotations that are specifically from the brass plates, much more difficult to resolve. That this is just a solid anachronism. Deutero-Isaiah should not be there, and yet the text is claiming that that's what it is. It does not fit with what the text is actually claiming it to be.
And you can't even use the revelation. You can't use the revelation theory, because he says, I am reading this from this. He's not saying I had a vision.
LoLo, you are underestimating the power of apologetics and apologists to just squeeze out whatever theory they possibly can and just slap that in there.
What was I thinking?
Here are the apologetic responses. I've got them. All right. So there are, I think, basically 3 ways of resolving this apologetically. We're going to see how good those resolutions are, but I think there are about 3 lines of evidence. The first is to just ignore the scholarship altogether, go with some of those presuppositional ideas about the Book of Mormon already being true, fit the data into your pre-established dogma, and run with that. You can do that. And
never fails.
This series is probably not for you if that's how you're going to go about resolving this. I have nothing else to offer other than stop it.
Don't do this.
Or pay a little bit more attention to what the data is actually telling you. I'm not. If there's anything I am dogmatic about, it's a dogmatic opposition to dogma. And this is just one of those very poor examples of that, but I do see people doing it, and that is actually what I tried to do. I tried to ignore the scholarship, so I'm guilty of that. Thank you, Sarah, for that one. That's good. I tried this, and it didn't work once I actually got into the data. It only works if you're going to just completely ignore it. Now, what's a bit more common, and this is something I saw Daniel Peterson doing when he was on Mormonism with the Murph, is doing these really, really poor challenges to the scholarship, just really, really flimsy. Basically so we've talked about how there are these 2 camps. You have the single authorship and the multiple authorship models for Isaiah's production. And within that multiple authorship camp, there are these scholarly fights that are happening to explain what's going on, right? So some scholars will say that there are 3 overall authors to the Isaiah, and then there are other scholars who it's an amalgamation. It's a whole bunch of different ones. We have no way of knowing for sure. It's just these stories that were all stitched together after the fact. And there are these lines of evidence and these arguments, and sometimes there are these sections where they're arguing about, well, where's the actual dividing line solidly for Deutero-Isaiah versus Trito-Isaiah and those sorts of things. And what someone like Dan Peterson is going to do is take those arguments, pull them out of their context of being in that particular space, and then claim that this is somehow potentially evidence for single authorship, or that they haven't actually resolved the multiple authorship question. But that isn't what's going on.
No.
On occasion, there will be these challenges. He pointed out that there was a line of evidence that was used to establish the multiple authorship theory, that one of the scholars who's like a leading proponent of the multiple authorship models of Isaiah was basically saying, hey guys, this line of evidence is not great. We need to stop using this particular line of evidence. He was super stoked about that one. And I did not care for his particular take on that because
no, that's so bad.
I've done that as a critic. I do that as a critic when I'm talking with folks on apologetic channels. There have been multiple times that somebody will bring up a certain critical argument, and I'll say, hey, like that particular criticism of this tradition is not great. Like it's not well founded on the evidence. We need to stop using that. So scholars doing scholarship should not be seen as tearing down a particular model. Scholars doing scholarship should actually be seen as what it is, innovative and valuable for the
right.
For the model. Yeah. Anyway, Dan Peterson, not a great take on Deutero-Isaiah and Mormonism with the Murph. That link is here, by the way. It's also in the references if you want to go ahead and check that out. Honestly, I do recommend that people check out what he has to say. They cover a lot of other topics besides Deutero-Isaiah, a lot of other critical arguments that come up. I was, shall I say, I'm going to steal Dan's own word. I was nonplussed by his apologetics on those critical arguments, unless they were like bringing up like the Spalding theory or something like that. Like, yeah, fine, whatever. It's not a great argument. Okay. So I'm laughing because you brought up this last one. So there are some who will argue that there is a revelation, a certain catalyst theory type thing. So obviously, Deutero-Isaiah could not have been on the brass plates.
Yeah.
And Nephi is claiming to read from the brass plates, and he is reading Deutero-Isaiah. So we have an issue, right? Well, what if, and hear me out on this one, LoLo, before you dismiss this one, what if Nephi was actually catalyzing? He was using the brass plates as a reference to catalyze, to basically automatically write what would be Deutero-Isaiah. He is receiving by revelation texts that will exist in the future, using the engravings of the brass plates as sort of a revelation inflection point. And the reason why he needs to write it down on the gold plates is because it doesn't actually physically exist on the brass plates. So he needs to write down what that revelation is, but it's just him taking the text there from
so
taking what's written on the brass plates and his revelation.
So the answer is Magic Sky Daddy.
I mean, if it's going to this is if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, right? So if it's good for Joseph Smith getting the Book of Abraham from Egyptian papyri, why couldn't Nephi have done the same thing?
I mean, well, I'm sold. Magic Sky Daddy for the win. I'm down. Yep.
All right. So what if
you sold me? You sold me.
So if God can just put this into Nephi's mind, okay, through some divine means, why are the brass plates even necessary, right? So Nephi claims to be reading from the brass plates to get this. If he's just going to have it revealed to him by revelation, why would the brass plates be necessary at all? Second,
I mean, it takes them 8 years to get from 300 feet. These people are bored. They need something to do, Perry.
And channeling future scripture seems to be a cool way of doing it.
I mean, they don't have Power Rangers or Netflix. What are we supposed to do?
Honestly, that's a fair point. That is a very fair point. So
my internet went out. I started making a trek to Salt Lake, and I almost started a religion.
If you're going to start a cult, that is as good of a reason as any. So we're kind of being very tongue-in-cheek about this. But the reason, and we're spending more time on this one than we did on the other two. But the reason why I'm even mentioning this is because I have gotten it. I have heard this from other people multiple times. Honestly, more often than I've heard like the flimsy dismissals of scholarship. I have heard this particular argument, and that's why I'm bringing it up here, because it's bad. But I've heard it so much, it just needs to be discussed. Okay, now here's the issue. Here's one of the other issues. Okay, we don't need the brass plates now all of a sudden, because if God can just reveal scripture, including future scripture, into a prophet's brain, and they can just write it down later on, then
Why?
no particular tool is necessarily necessary for it. In fact, a seer stone should be a viable option. Nephi should be able to act as a seer.
Yes.
And I don't see any particular limitation on why he wouldn't be able to do that. And if he's then able to do that and able to channel the scripture and to reveal it, Laban did not need to die.
What if Laban just
plain
sucked,
and simple?
though? I mean, what if he was just
does not? Then let somebody in Jerusalem take care of it. Let Nebuchadnezzar take care of it. I mean, if you've read the story of what happens to Zedekiah, Nebuchadnezzar would have dealt with Laban in some fun and exciting ways, I am sure.
I say so they say that rap music and video games make people violent. Nay, I say.
No, that's just ingrained. No, like Laban. This for me. This is one of the huge moral issues with this particular argument. If Nephi is just able to reveal the scripture, if Joseph Smith is just able to reveal scripture using something as an inspiration like this, then Nephi killing Laban is just heinously immoral. There is now no justification. At least the justification before was to save souls. And now that is a completely useless justification, completely useless argument, because apologists need to protect this text. These are usually armchair apologists at this point in time that are protecting it this way. So they need to protect the text. And so they come up with these arguments that if you actually apply them rationally and logically and consistently, completely destroy the justification, any sort of moral justification for Nephi killing Laban. Which makes it all the worse when Nephi later on has no guilt whatsoever.
None.
In his killing Laban.
Joseph said, oops, my bad. Not Joseph Smith, Joseph Sullivan. Joseph Smith's like, my bad, y'all. I'm sorry.
Whoopsie.
Just kidding. No, that was my husband.
The other issue with this is that the Book of Mormon throughout is obsessed with this idea of preserving these records, these Nephite records, and passing them throughout generations, so that way they would be able to be used and for the benefit of the people then, but also for the people today, especially the Lamanites today. That is very, very much the concern and the thesis of the text throughout, is that this record of Jesus Christ needs to be passed down through the generations, ultimately down to us. And that would be translated through Joseph Smith. But if we can just divine these scriptures out of thin air, if we can just divine these records, there is no reason for the gold plates to exist. There's no reason for any of that to exist. None of those narratives that actually play in. And so basically, Moroni, not Captain, but Moroni, son of Mormon, wasted the last so many years of his life running around and hiding.
His whole life, and he was the last running around in the woods, doesn't have any family, and he's sorry, dude. We could have just, gotten this.
Whoops,
later.
Didn't need it.
Our bad.
So this particular apologetic has issues beyond issues, and it has the consequence of establishing a narrative that, if applied rationally, would dismantle the need for so many other things that it just moves us out of the realm of morality. Either God, it makes God into a trickster God. It makes God into a God that, frankly, is just not worth worshiping because he's kind of a jerk.
He's a jerk. Yeah. Jinx.
Yeah.
My God's a jerk.
I'm gonna have to knock on wood or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Great mind.
Yeah. No. This is just. I don't know. I don't know what to do with this besides say that apologists need to quit on this particular line. Morality and religion are oxymoronical, says Sarah Siri. Yeah. Yeah. I see that.
But if you go with the Josephites, the community of Christ, whatever, however you want to label them, problem solved. It's not a historical
Honestly,
document. It is a good document. It teaches in parables. It gives you morality. It gives you this. It gives you, they can say all the great things without having to be apologetics, because like you said, what is there to apologize for at that point?
100%, 100%. That's one of the things I like about that tradition. We're not necessarily advocating any one particular conclusion, but yeah, they do have a resolution to this problem that.
Oh, no. Disagree. I am 100% backing a religion. I think we should all go live in the woods and, paint ourselves with mud and just scream. That's my religious. Go be woods people. Go back to nature.
Right.
Eat lost travelers. Be the Baba Yaga you were always meant to be.
Slay Queen. Okay. So just in case we haven't beaten this dead horse enough yet, or this dead table as the case may be, Deutero-Isaiah is anachronistic to the Book of Mormon. It is a huge anachronism that cannot be resolved by any rationally applied apologetic. And the fact that it is in there, one anachronism is enough to disprove historicity of the text. And this one is so overwhelming and so irreconcilable with the actual data. I just don't see it going anywhere. You might one day find a steel sword, a pre-Columbian steel sword. That remains in the realm of things that could potentially possibly occur. Highly unlikely. I don't think it will ever happen, but it does remain within the realm of potentialities. You're not resolving this one.
No.
Deutero-Isaiah it's just too well substantiated by the data that currently exists. There is no consistent single authorship. The only possible way would be to find a pre-exilic copy of Isaiah that includes Deutero-Isaiah, and that just isn't happening. I would, if I get to eat my words on that, like, super cool, honestly. And I will walk back this entire criticism and do a full video on that if that ever happens. It's not going to. This is going to remain.
I'm binge watching SVU, Law and Order. I feel like with this evidence, Benson and Stabler are putting you in jail. There's no way you can. Sorry.
Yep. There is only a fringe scholarly view that is reliant upon pre-established dogmas that agrees with the single authorship that would be necessary for the Book of Mormon to remain historical. And there just isn't data, and any of the apologetics that exist for trying to maintain that are essentially weak or completely unsubstantiated by any evidence. So, all right.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it's not possible. Is that correct? Because I mean, you've been kind of subtle about it. So
yeah, so within like a sort of statistical definition of possibility, like we could all be brains in a vat somewhere. So if we're gonna
no, that's
just
true.
ignore the problems of like hard solipsism or those sorts of like challenges like that. Within the confines of this reality, as we understand it, no, it's not going to change. All right, so I told you to put a pin in the overall like historicity like picture, right? So let's do that here. So at the start of this, we talked about we can imagine historicity on a scale from 0 to 100. Okay, and what we did was we said, hey, Lehi is historically possible but unlikely. That doesn't really move us anywhere on this particular scale. But then Nephi killing Laban, completely ahistorical. So we're just gonna tick that down the bush. Sorry, I read that. I read this here ahead of time instead of actually continuing my thought properly. This is distracting trying to manage the comment.
It won't let me comment back to people. No, I'm trying, but it won't let me. Like, I can read them, but it won't let me write them back.
That's annoying.
It keeps saying I need to connect to YouTube, and I tried, but YouTube doesn't want me to connect. YouTube and I are having some miscommunication.
It might be because you're in on the second account, and that's why. Interesting. You're in as a guest, right? So I'm in. Yeah. Sorry, we're dealing with this is our first time live streaming, so we're dealing with the some of the technical ins and outs. Okay. Yeah, so quick,
So
the
I
bush
can wait.
tells what
I
you're really
can read
saying
them, but I just can't reply.
right. Yeah, so I ultimately for me, this is the death knell of Book of Mormon historicity. We'll get to that. But it's done at this point, right? So we have the scale 0 to 100 on historicity. Nephi killing Laban ticks us down less than 100. So we're somewhere now between 0 and 99. And then Lehi's Christology is largely anachronistic. We're now even less confident. Revelation of John, the way that that's used is erroneous, less confident. Nahum gives some historical possibility, but that's weakly connected. So at best, that ticks us slightly upwards. Deutero-Isaiah here, though, this moves me to 0.
I was going to say, there's no way.
So, and this depends on your definition of historicity, right? So if we have a Spider-Man comic and it talks about New York City, and it talks about Queens, and it talks about something that happened there that is historically founded, is that Spider-Man comic greater than 0% historical? If we say that, then I have that same level of historical confidence in the Book of Mormon, because it does talk about things that are historical. Zedekiah being a king in Jerusalem and the eventual conquest and all of that is historical. It's contained in the Bible, so it's taken from another reference, and so there's no unique historicity that's added in by the Book of Mormon.
Right.
So in terms of any sort of like unique claims having historicity, 0%.
Right. Because
this is a product of Joseph Smith mind.
In Alice in Wonderland, they discuss in the beginning, they discuss historical people, historical things that are accurate and time period appropriate. But I also don't think that they were playing croquet with flamingos in real life. So,
and yeah, so this might be a bit rough comparisons for somebody who is like holding this dogmatically. It's just the fact of the matter is that there isn't any unique claim in the Book of Mormon that we've been able to validate historically. And the best that apologists have come up with is 3 letters on an altar that have nothing to actually do with the Book of Mormon, and then a gravestone that has the name Ishmael around that spot. That again has no obvious or apparent connection to the Book of Mormon figure of Ishmael. That's what they have, and everything else that we could look at that could try and kind of bring us into historicity just falls apart on any actual examination. Now, that doesn't mean that the text is without value. And again, we've talked multiple times about the way that the Josephites have approached this and the way that they use it as a non-historical sort of a parable type text. But yeah, I think with this particular, especially now here at the end of First Nephi, we are done with what is actually historically testable, and we have the Deutero-Isaiah issue here brought up right at the very end. I'm pretty much sold on this being an ahistorical text, and we can move on from value move on into its value as a myth, as a philosophical text, as a theological text, on its role in actually showing us how 19th century Christians were viewing theology, what their engagement was with the white world, how they were viewing settler myths, and the beginning, the proto-manifest destiny, if you will, since manifest destiny is a later innovation, but at least some of the seeds of those ideas are present in the Book of Mormon. And we can talk about those things and how those are developing and how that plays in. And honestly, the Book of Mormon is a fascinating text from that perspective.
It really is.
You know, eat your heart out, Mark Twain, on it being chloroform in print. I will grant that there are parts of it that are quite slow. Okay. Honestly,
so
that's where I'm at.
I am giving the historicity of this 0 out of 5 Liahonas.
0 out of 5 Liahonas. All right.
Yeah, that's for my thoughts.
Not even
and
a
that's
spindle?
Going to be mine. Oh, maybe a spindle. Maybe.
Ooh, yeah, you're giving it more than I would. Honestly, I would not give you a
spindle. No spindle for you. But no, I agree with you 100%.
And yeah, it's what I think is going to be great now is that we can take the Isaiah chapters in Second Nephi. There's a whole section where we're going to be talking about the Isaiah chapters, and now we can sit and actually talk about what is Isaiah talking about here, what is actually going on in this particular section, why should we find this interesting, and we'll take it within that context rather than trying to put in what the Book of Mormon has going on with it, or what your mainstream Christians are going to try to twist this text into talking about. We can talk about those things. I think it'll be more interesting that way. Yeah.
It says the problem of evil. I don't find evil to be a problem. Like Mae West said, the only way to handle temptation is to give in.
It's a problem for classical theism. So yeah, next week we're going to be talking about 2 Nephi 1-2. Lehi is going to get super, 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 super old, and he's going to talk about Adam and Eve, and then a bit on the problem of evil and what the Book of Mormon presents as a solution to the problem of evil for classical theism, which I find actually we're going to have quite a bit of praise for how good the Book of Mormon handles that particular issue in next week. So if this episode this seems rough, next week we actually do have some good praise for what the Book of Mormon is presenting. So yeah, I guess with that, thank you all for joining us in the audience. And this has been a lot of fun. Lolo, do you have anything you want to shout out to the folks?
Wait, what happened? I'm sorry, I was putting you back on the
if you had anything. I asked if you had anything you wanted to shout out to the folks.
Thank you so much. Did you enjoy this? Is this something you'd like to see us do again? That's my question.
Yeah. Great. And then don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends, share with that annoying relative who you're worried about having your next Thanksgiving dinner with. And just
send us to all of your Mormon family and friends. You're gonna love
always listeners. Thank you all so much. Y'all have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time in the next episode of Come Follow Me with Lolo and Perry.